January 19, 2010. Dubai International Airport received more than 90,000 passengers that day, a figure so ordinary for that particular hub that it warranted no special mention in any record or report. The terminals moved with the practiced efficiency of a machine that never stopped, the conveyor belts and passport queues and taxi ranks cycling through the business of global movement with the indifference of infrastructure that simply exists to be used. Winter in Dubai carried none of the harshness winter brought to the places most of those passengers had come from. The air outside was warm and clean, touched with the faint mineral quality of the Gulf, and the sky above the city was the kind of deep, uncomplicated blue that made the towers along Sheikh Zayed Road look like something assembled specifically for a postcard. At 8:25 in the morning, a heavy-set man in his early 50s presented a Syrian travel document at passport control in Terminal 1. The name on the document was not his own. It read Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh, which was his real name, but he had other names he used depending on the journey, depending on the destination, depending on what the occasion required. He carried himself with the measured ease of a man who had passed through dozens of airports in dozens of countries over 2 decades, and had learned that the best way to attract no attention was to behave as though the idea of attention had never occurred to him. He was not nervous. He had no visible reason to be. To the officer at the booth, he was just another traveler out of Damascus, one of countless thousands transiting through the region on business that the travel document described in the vaguest possible terms. What the passport control officer could not have known, what no one in that terminal was in a position to notice at a glance, was that the man presenting his document was one of the most consequential figures in the hidden architecture of armed Palestinian resistance. For more than 20 years, Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh had been the person Hamas turned to when it needed weapons. Not rifles purchased from a local dealer, not ammunition scraped together from whatever sources happened to be available, but sophisticated military hardware sourced from the Islamic Republic of Iran and routed through a supply chain of extraordinary complexity to the sealed borders of the Gaza Strip. He had built that network essentially from nothing in the years following the Oslo Accords, when Hamas had made the deliberate decision to reject negotiation and pursue armed struggle as the only viable path to its objectives. The rockets that had been landing in Israeli towns, the anti-tank missiles that had made Israeli armor cautious, the technological evolution of Hamas's military capacity over the preceding decade, all of it flowed, at least in significant part, through arrangements that Al-Mabhouh had made possible. He was not just an operative. He was an architect. He was also a man with decades of blood in his history, not as a distant bureaucratic matter but as the direct, traceable result of specific actions he had taken and specific orders he had given. Israel's intelligence services had maintained a file on Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh for more than 20 years, updating it with each confirmed sighting, each new piece of information about his movements, each additional detail that emerged from sources inside Hamas and inside the governments that quietly hosted his operations. The file described a man who had proven over and over again that he was effectively impossible to catch through conventional means, who moved between capitals with practiced ease, who changed identities and travel patterns often enough to stay ahead of the surveillance that was always at some level on his trail. The file also described what would need to happen if he were ever to be stopped. Al-Mabhouh collected his single bag from the carousel, passed through the arrivals hall, and stepped out into the January morning. He had visited Dubai before many times. The city served as a useful transit point for exactly the kind of work he did, a place where businessmen from every country on earth converged without too much official scrutiny of what precisely that business might involve. The financial infrastructure was sophisticated, the hotel industry was world-class, and the prevailing attitude toward commercial activity of all kinds was one of pragmatic accommodation. Dubai had made itself into one of the planet's great crossroads, and that quality made it useful to men who needed to move money and information and people without leaving obvious footprints. He had come this time to meet with associates involved in the next phase of a weapons procurement arrangement that had been months in the negotiation. The details of those arrangements would never become fully public, but investigators and intelligence analysts who later reconstructed his final trip concluded that he was in Dubai to coordinate the transfer of funds related to incoming arms shipments from Iran, working through intermediaries whose identities remained protected even after his death. It was routine work for him, or as routine as any element of his life had been for the past 20 years. He moved through it with the professionalism of a man who had long since made his peace with the risk that came with the territory. The taxi took him south along the highway, past the gleaming architecture that Dubai had assembled out of will and oil revenue in the space of a single generation. He checked his phone, looked at his notes, settled into the rhythm of the ride. The Al Bustan Radana Hotel in the Garhoud district, a modern, clean, business-like establishment that catered to exactly the kind of traveler who needed comfort without ostentation, had been booked in his assumed name. It was not a hotel that anyone would have connected, at first glance, to anything particularly significant. The lobby was all polished marble and efficient staff and the faint playing of ambient music through concealed speakers, the kind of space designed expressly to make the business traveler feel at ease. Al-Mabhouh checked in, took his key card, and rode the elevator to the second floor. Room 230. He had no way of knowing that, at that precise moment, other guests on the same floor, other people who had checked in to the Al Bustan Radana in the preceding 48 hours, were people who knew exactly who he was. Not acquaintances, not fellow travelers in any meaningful sense, but members of a team that had been assembled and positioned specifically around his arrival. They had been watching the airport. They had watched him collect his bag and get into the taxi. Someone had relayed his arrival in real time to a coordination point from which the information was distributed instantly to every relevant position. The team knew he was in room 230 within minutes of his stepping off the elevator. There were, in total, 27 of them. 27 people who had arrived in Dubai over the preceding 3 days, some singly, some in pairs, traveling on passports issued by 6 different countries, presenting themselves to the same hotels and the same streets and the same public spaces as ordinary visitors with ordinary reasons for being in one of the world's great tourist and commercial destinations. They carried cameras and wore tennis clothes and sat in hotel lobby cafes reading newspapers and doing all the things that ordinary visitors do, and none of it was what it appeared to be. Each person in that network had a role, and each role had been determined in advance, and the whole structure had been built around a single objective: that Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh would not leave Dubai alive. The scale of what had been deployed to kill one man was, by any measure, extraordinary. Intelligence operations of this kind typically relied on small, tight-knit teams. The larger the group, the greater the exposure, the more points of failure, the harder it was to maintain the kind of operational security that kept participants alive and identities covered. 27 people represented something closer to a small military unit than a classic covert assassination cell, and the decision to commit that many resources to a single operation reflected something important about how Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh was assessed by the people who wanted him dead. He was not a target of convenience. He was not an opportunistic strike. He was the result of years of patient intelligence work and years of political calculation, and the scale of the operation mounted against him was proportional to the scale of the threat his continued existence represented. 27 assassins. 6 different nationalities. Forged passports from 4 Western countries. A single target in a hotel room on the second floor, and not one of the people sent to kill him would ever be brought to justice. What was caught on camera that night in Dubai is one of the most forensically documented assassination operations in modern history, and yet the questions it raised about state-sanctioned killing, stolen identities, and the invisible rules of modern intelligence warfare were never fully answered. If that is the kind of story you watch this channel for, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. What happened in room 230 deserves to be seen in its full detail. To understand why 27 people had converged on a single hotel in Dubai on a January morning in 2010, you have to understand the man in room 230, not the abstract designation on an intelligence file, but the actual human being who had arrived at this particular intersection of history and geography through a specific set of choices made across a very specific and very violent life. You have to go back to where he started. You have to go back to a refugee camp in the northern Gaza Strip in the years when the word Hamas did not yet exist, when the movement that would eventually give that name its terrible weight in international affairs was still forming in the minds and meetings of a small group of men who believed that armed resistance was not just permissible but obligatory, and that the organization of that resistance was the most important work a Palestinian of their generation could do. You have to go back to the beginning of Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh. The Jabalia refugee camp occupies a thin strip of land in the northern Gaza Strip, and in 1960, the year Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh was born, it was already more than a decade old and already far beyond anything its original planners had imagined. The camp had been established in 1948 in the immediate aftermath of the First Arab-Israeli War, intended as temporary shelter for Palestinians who had fled or been expelled from their villages in what became the State of Israel. Temporary had lasted 12 years by the time Al-Mabhouh arrived in the world, and there was nothing about the physical reality of Jabalia that suggested the word temporary had ever applied. Concrete block buildings pressed against each other along narrow, unpaved lanes. Water came from communal standpipes. A United Nations relief agency called UNRWA administered the camp, providing schooling and food rations that kept people alive, but not much more than that. There were no jobs to speak of, no economy worth the name, and a population that had grown faster than the infrastructure meant to support it, adding children and grandchildren to the original displaced generation until the camp contained more people than many small cities and occupied a space that could barely contain them. It was into this environment that Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh was born, the son of a Palestinian refugee family who had come originally from a village in the coastal plain of what was now Israeli territory. His father had been a young man in 1948, old enough to remember where he had come from, young enough that his entire adult life would be defined by having been removed from it. Al-Mabhouh grew up hearing the stories of that village, the way families in the camp passed those stories down with the careful intensity of people maintaining a claim they believed was still valid, still waiting to be exercised. The house that had been left behind, the land that had been tended for generations, the specific quality of light on a particular hillside in a particular season. These things were not abstractions for the people of Jabalia. They were a form of ongoing grievance that accumulated interest with every year that passed without resolution. But by the time Israel had formed that calculation, Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh was already gone. The Israeli security crackdown that followed the Intifada and the targeted arrests and killings that accompanied it persuaded him that remaining in Gaza meant death or imprisonment. He left, probably in 1990 or 1991, for Damascus, where Hamas maintained its external political bureau and where several other senior figures in the movement's military wing had found operational space under the protection of the Syrian government, which had its own strategic reasons for hosting an organization that kept pressure on Israel from the south. He would not live in Gaza again for the rest of his life. From Damascus and later from connections in Tehran, he would build the network that made him more dangerous in exile than he had ever been at home. The two Israeli soldiers died less than 3 months apart, and their deaths were not forgettable the way many deaths in a prolonged conflict become forgettable through sheer accumulation. Avi Sasportas was 22 years old, stationed at a hitchhiking post near Ashkelon in February 1989 when he disappeared. He had been on his way back from a weekend leave, standing at the side of the road in the way that Israeli soldiers routinely did, hitching rides to save time on the bus routes that connected the towns and bases of the country's interior. He never arrived at his destination. His body was found more than 2 months later, in a field near Kibbutz Galon, killed by a single gunshot wound. He had been held for weeks before he died. Ilan Sadon was also 22. He vanished in May of the same year, taken from a similar hitchhiking post under similar circumstances, part of a pattern that Hamas's military operatives had identified as an exploitable vulnerability in Israeli security culture. The practice of soldiers hitching rides was perfectly ordinary and perfectly legal, a product of a country where military service was universal and where the infrastructure of civilian and military life was intertwined in ways that left soldiers moving through public space routinely and without escort. Hamas's cell had recognized in that practice an opportunity and had built an operation around it. Sadon was also eventually found dead, shot. The two operations shook Israeli society with a particular force because of what they represented beyond the individual tragedies. The Intifada had produced a great deal of violence and a great deal of death, but most of it was the relatively chaotic violence of a popular uprising, stone-throwing, Molotov cocktails, clashes in the narrow streets of the occupied territories. The abductions of Sasportas and Sadon were something different. They were organized, patient, and coldly executed, requiring coordination, safe houses, the ability to hold prisoners for extended periods, and the discipline to operate undetected for months. They demonstrated that Hamas's military wing had capabilities that Israel's security services had underestimated. The Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, launched an extensive investigation and eventually identified the cell responsible. Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh was named as one of the organizers and one of those directly involved in the operation's execution. By the time that identification was made, as noted, Al-Mabhouh was already in Syria. Israel issued a warrant. Interpol was notified. None of it came close to reaching him. Syria was not going to extradite a Hamas operative to Israel. The warrant became a piece of paper kept in a file, updated periodically as new intelligence arrived, circulated through the channels of international intelligence cooperation where it was noted but could not be acted upon. It joined the growing archive of cases where perpetrators of violence against Israelis had found sanctuary in states that Israel could not compel to cooperate, and it waited for something to change. The doctrine that governed what Israel would do when legal channels produced nothing had been shaped over the preceding 4 decades by a sequence of events and institutional decisions that formed one of the most debated chapters in the history of modern intelligence services. It began, in its most deliberate and organized form, with the Munich massacre of September 1972, when 11 Israeli athletes were killed by the Palestinian Black September organization at the Olympic Games in West Germany. The operation was a catastrophic failure of German security arrangements and a propaganda disaster for the Palestinian cause, but its most significant long-term consequence was the decision made at the highest levels of the Israeli government to respond not through international legal channels but through the systematic elimination of those responsible. Prime Minister Golda Meir authorized a campaign that became known, after the fact, by various names including Operation Wrath of God, a sustained covert program in which Mossad operatives hunted down and killed the individuals identified as having organized or participated in the Munich attack. The campaign unfolded over years and across multiple countries: Paris, Rome, Nicosia, Beirut. It was not clean. One of its most notorious moments was the killing of an innocent Moroccan waiter in Lillehammer, Norway in 1973, mistakenly identified as a target, an incident that resulted in the arrest of several Mossad operatives and a significant political crisis for Israel. But the broader program continued, and it established in the institutional DNA of Israeli intelligence a precedent and a methodology that has never fully been abandoned. The unit within Mossad responsible for these targeted killings has been known by different designations over the years, the most commonly cited being Kaidan, a Hebrew word meaning bayonet. Kaidan is understood to be a compartmentalized unit within Mossad's Caesarea Directorate, which handles the service's most sensitive human intelligence operations abroad. Its existence has never been officially confirmed by Israel, and its operational details have been described primarily through the accounts of former intelligence officers, investigative journalists, and the occasional inadvertent revelation produced by a mission gone wrong. What is consistently described is a unit of highly trained operatives capable of conducting surveillance, planning, and executing targeted killings in foreign countries while maintaining operational security of a very high order. The word most often used in accounts of Kaidan's methods is professional, a term that carries, in this context, the particular weight of its euphemistic associations. The political landscape of the camp during Al-Mabhouh's childhood was shaped by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had emerged in the mid-1960s as the dominant voice of Palestinian nationalism under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. The PLO's Fatah faction controlled most of the political ground in the camps, but it was far from the only presence. Marxist groups competed for influence among young men who found the PLO's nationalism insufficient, who wanted a more radical theory of liberation. Religious organizations connected to the Muslim Brotherhood maintained their own networks, quieter and slower growing but persistently present. The camp was, in this sense, a kind of incubator for political radicalization in several directions simultaneously, all of them premised on the shared conviction that Palestinian displacement was an injustice that demanded correction, and that peaceful negotiation had already failed. Al-Mabhouh came of age politically in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a period during which the landscape shifted decisively. The 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran demonstrated to an entire generation of young militants across the Middle East that an entrenched secular order supported by Western powers could be overthrown by a religiously motivated mass movement. The 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the subsequent massacre of Palestinian civilians at the Sabra and Shatila camps by Lebanese Christian militias while Israeli forces stood nearby produced a wave of outrage in the Palestinian community that directed itself particularly at those who believed political solutions remained possible. For young men in Jabalia watching events unfold through the limited news access available in the camp, the direction of those emotions was toward the growing influence of the Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliated Palestinian movement, which by that point was coalescing around the figure of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Sheikh Yassin was a quadriplegic cleric who led a network of Islamic social services in Gaza, mosques, schools, clinics, that served a population largely abandoned by the formal political structures around it. His movement had, throughout the 1970s, been tolerated and even quietly encouraged by Israel as a counterweight to the PLO's secular nationalism. What Israeli intelligence analysts either missed or miscalculated was the speed with which that same movement, under the pressure of occupation and the influence of events across the region, was being transformed from a network of social services into the framework of an armed resistance organization. Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh found his way into that framework sometime in the early 1980s, drawn by the combination of religious conviction and the specific promise of an organization that intended to match words with actions. He was by all accounts a practical man rather than an ideological theorist, more interested in the operational details of resistance than in the doctrinal arguments that occupied the religious scholars around him. He had a talent for organization, for logistics, for the unglamorous work of arranging material without leaving obvious traces. A talent that would define his career and his usefulness to Hamas for the rest of his life. He also had the willingness to direct violence, which the founding generation of Hamas's military wing required first and foremost. When the organization that would call itself Hamas was formally established in December 1987, in the early weeks of the First Intifada, Al-Mabhouh was not among its founding public figures, but he was already embedded in the networks from which the movement's armed capacity would be built. The First Intifada, a popular uprising against Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza that began in December 1987 and lasted until 1993, transformed the political situation in the occupied territories in ways that still shape the present. It was less organized than what followed and operated largely through strikes, stone throwing, and civil disobedience, but it also contained within it pockets of organized violence, cells of young men who believed that the uprising needed a military dimension and were willing to provide one. Hamas's ad-Din al-Qassam brigades emerged during this period as the organization's armed wing, named for a Syrian-Palestinian preacher and guerrilla fighter killed by British forces in 1935, whose memory had been maintained in Palestinian political consciousness as a symbol of principled armed resistance. Al-Mabhouh was part of the generation that built the Qassam brigades in Gaza during the early years of the Intifada, and he brought to that work the same methodical, operational orientation that had made him useful in the preceding years. The stakes of that work became clear in early 1989, in a series of operations that would permanently mark Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh's name in the consciousness of Israeli intelligence and that would, more than 2 decades later, be cited as a direct motivating factor in the operation that killed him. In February 1989, Israeli soldier Ilan Sadon went missing near Tel Aviv. His body was found weeks later. In May 1989, a second Israeli soldier, Avi Sisportas, was abducted and killed. Both killings were connected to Hamas's military wing operating out of Gaza, and both were connected specifically to Al-Mabhouh. According to accounts that later emerged from Israeli intelligence assessments and from Hamas sources themselves, Al-Mabhouh was directly involved in organizing and directing both operations. By Israeli law and by the strategic logic of their intelligence services, those killings made Al-Mabhouh a permanent target, not merely someone to be monitored but someone whose continued existence represented an ongoing threat to be eliminated. The Qassam brigades had demonstrated that they were capable of reaching inside Israel to kill soldiers. Al-Mabhouh had been part of making that demonstration possible. There would be no diplomatic channel through which accountability could be sought, no court that could compel extradition from the territories where he operated, no mechanism of conventional justice that applied to the particular space he inhabited. The calculation that applied in such cases within the institutional culture of Israeli intelligence was one that had been applied many times before and would be applied many times again. If the law could not reach him, operational capacity would have to serve instead. The Kaidan model, as it emerged over the decades following Munich, relied on a core principle: that Israel possessed both the right and the obligation to pursue those who threatened the state and its citizens beyond the reach of conventional law, and that this pursuit could be conducted by intelligence operatives acting with plausible deniability across national boundaries. The legal framework underpinning this doctrine exists in a deliberately ambiguous space. Israel has never publicly acknowledged the program or its specific operations, which means there is no official legal text to examine. Former Israeli officials who have spoken about the policy, most notably in memoirs and interviews given after they left positions of authority, have invariably framed it in terms of existential necessity and proportionate response, arguing that the alternatives were either accepting ongoing violence or conducting operations that would cause far greater civilian casualties than a precisely targeted killing. The critics of this doctrine, who include international law scholars, human rights organizations, and the governments of the countries whose territory has been used for such operations, argue something entirely different. They argue that extrajudicial killing, assassination by another name, represents a fundamental violation of the sovereignty of the states in whose territory it occurs, a bypassing of due process that places an intelligence service in the role of judge, jury, and executioner without accountability to any external authority. They argue that the precedent it sets is corrosive. If one state may claim the right to kill its enemies wherever it finds them, every state possesses that same right in theory, and the practical consequences of that universalized principle would be catastrophic. These arguments have been made with great force and considerable documentation. They have not changed Israeli policy. For Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh, the abstractness of that policy debate had entirely concrete implications. He understood from the time he left Gaza that he was on a list. He had helped kill Israeli soldiers. He had organized operations against Israeli targets. He had then built one of the most effective weapons pipelines Hamas had ever operated, making him responsible not just for the 1989 killings but for a continuous flow of military capacity that led to the deaths of many more Israelis in the years and decades that followed. He was not naive about what that meant. He had survived 2 previous attempts on his life. The exact details of those attempts have never been fully verified publicly, but it is widely reported that Mossad had tried to reach him at least once before Dubai and had failed. He took precautions. He varied his travel patterns. He used multiple passports and identities. He traveled with protection when he could arrange it and without it when he had to. But the precautions of a single man, however experienced and however careful, are finite. The institutional resources of a national intelligence service, pursuing a single objective over years and decades, are effectively inexhaustible. Somewhere in the documentation trail of cross-border travel, somewhere in the financial transactions connected to the arms procurement network, somewhere in the communications and meetings and intermediary relationships that sustained his operation, there was always the possibility that something would surface, that a source would report, that a technical collection tool would intercept a piece of information that updated the file and brought the calculation one step closer to executable. By 2009, that process had reached a point where the file on Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh was no longer theoretical. It was operational. The specific intelligence that enabled the 2010 operation has never been fully disclosed. What is known from the subsequent investigation and from accounts provided by security sources in various countries is that Israeli intelligence had acquired enough confirming information about Al-Mabhouh's travel patterns to predict with reasonable confidence when and where he would be reachable. Dubai featured in that picture because it was a city he was known to visit regularly. A city where the combination of legitimate commercial infrastructure and relatively permissive oversight of financial transactions made it useful to his work. He did not hide his presence in Dubai in any absolute sense. He used assumed names and altered travel documents, but he moved through the city's hotels and meeting points with the background regularity of someone who had decided that Dubai was safe enough. That assessment was about to be proven entirely wrong. Damascus in the early 1990s was a particular kind of city for a man in Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh's position. The Syrian capital under Hafez al-Assad operated as a state that maintained firm control over its own population while offering carefully calibrated hospitality to a range of Palestinian militant organizations that found it useful to maintain external bureaus outside the territories where they actually operated. The logic of this arrangement was straightforward enough. Syria had fought multiple wars with Israel and maintained a state of formal belligerence toward it. The two countries technically at war for decades without any peace agreement or normalization of relations. Hosting organizations committed to armed struggle against Israel was therefore not merely a matter of ideological sympathy but of strategic alignment, and the Assad government provided the Hamas External Political Bureau and various affiliated figures with a degree of shelter and operational space that would have been impossible anywhere else in the region at the time. Al-Mabhouh settled into Damascus with the particular task of a man who knew exactly what he needed to build and had the combination of connections, patience, and practical intelligence to build it. He was not part of the public political leadership of Hamas, the figures who gave press conferences and issued statements and appeared on television to explain the organization's positions to international audiences. He was, from the beginning, part of the apparatus that operated in the shadows of that public presence, the part that arranged the material support for the military wing, that maintained contact with the suppliers of weapons and the handlers of money, that kept the operational infrastructure functioning regardless of what was happening on the political surface. The relationship with Iran was central to everything he built. The Islamic Republic had been an ideological supporter of Palestinian resistance since its founding in 1979, but the nature of that support shifted over the decades from primarily rhetorical to increasingly material. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, specifically its Quds Force, was the organizational instrument through which Tehran projected military influence beyond its borders. And by the early 1990s, it had identified Hamas's military wing as a partner worth substantial investment. Al-Mabhouh became one of the key conduits through which that investment moved from Iranian storage facilities to Palestinian hands. The weapons themselves were varied and evolved as technology advanced and as the needs of Hamas's military operations changed. In the early years, the focus was on small arms, ammunition, and the components for building improvised explosive devices, the basic toolkit of a resistance organization operating in a confined territory under military occupation. As time passed and as Hamas developed greater ambition, the emphasis shifted toward longer-range rockets capable of reaching Israeli towns beyond the border fence, toward anti-tank missiles that could threaten armored vehicles, toward the kind of military hardware that transformed what had been a guerrilla organization into something resembling a standing military force. The Qassam rockets that gave their name to Hamas's armed wing and that fell on Sderot and Ashkelon and, in later years, on Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, all of it traced back in significant part to the procurement lines that Al-Mabhouh had helped establish and maintain. The physical movement of weapons from Iran to Gaza required an elaborate solution to a basic geographical problem. Israel and Gaza share a border, and Israel controlled every formal crossing point into the territory. Direct supply was therefore impossible. The route that developed instead ran through a supply chain of extraordinary length and complexity, passing through Iranian territory to Sudan, and then north through Egypt, and under the border through a network of tunnels dug beneath the Philadelphia corridor at Rafah. The tunnel network itself became one of the most remarkable feats of improvised infrastructure in the contemporary conflict. Hundreds of shafts and connecting passages dug by hand over years by a population motivated by the combination of commercial incentive and political commitment, capable of moving not just weapons but food, fuel, construction materials, and people through the blockade that Israel and Egypt had imposed on Gaza's borders. Al-Mabhouh's role sat at the upstream end of this system. He dealt with the Iranians, negotiated the types and quantities of weapons, arranged the financing, and managed the logistics of getting materials into the pipeline that would eventually deliver them to Gaza. He also built a parallel capacity in Syria itself, maintaining relationships with Syrian military officials and with other Palestinian factions based in Damascus that gave him access to additional sources of armaments and technical expertise. The picture that emerges from intelligence reports, subsequent investigations, and the accounts of people who dealt with him is of a man who was genuinely skilled at the particular tradecraft his work required, patient enough to cultivate relationships over years, pragmatic enough to work with whoever could provide what Hamas needed regardless of political differences, and operationally cautious enough to structure arrangements in ways that kept his own fingerprints at a comfortable remove from the transactions he was managing. He traveled extensively as part of this work, and travel was both a professional necessity and his primary vulnerability. A man who stayed in one place could be contained or monitored indefinitely without ever creating a moment when action was feasible. A man who moved between countries, who appeared at airports and hotels and meeting points in cities where the protective intelligence relationships that sustained him in Damascus did not fully apply. That man created windows. Dubai had become, over the years of the early 2000s, one of the cities that appeared in Al-Mabhouh's travel record with enough regularity to attract serious attention. The city's role as a financial and commercial hub for the entire region meant that it was a natural meeting point for the kind of business he conducted, and its relationship with the various intelligence services that tracked him was meaningfully different from Damascus or Tehran. The United Arab Emirates in 2010 maintained diplomatic relations with most Western nations and a quiet but genuinely functional security relationship with Israeli intelligence. Dubai, under the umbrella of the UAE's Directorate of Intelligence, cooperated with Western counterparts on matters of terrorism and money laundering in ways that Damascus emphatically did not. This did not mean that Mossad was free to operate on Emirati soil without consequence. The events following January 19th would make very clear that the UAE took its sovereignty seriously, but it did mean that the intelligence picture available to Israeli planners about Al-Mabhouh's movements in Dubai was significantly richer than what could be assembled by observing him in Syria. The Iranian connections that defined Al-Mabhouh's professional life also defined the geopolitical stakes attached to eliminating him. By 2009 and 2010, the relationship between Iran and Hamas had reached a point of extraordinary strategic significance. Hamas had taken control of the Gaza Strip in 2007 following a violent internal conflict with Fatah, the movement that controlled the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. The Hamas takeover had been met with an international boycott and an Israeli-Egyptian blockade, but it had also deepened Iran's investment in the organization, which now governed a territory and possessed military capabilities that created ongoing leverage over Israel. The rockets that Hamas was launching from Gaza were no longer primitive homemade devices. Some of them had ranges measured in dozens of kilometers, putting major Israeli population centers within reach. Al-Mabhouh's work had contributed meaningfully to that escalation, and Israeli intelligence assessed that his continued operation would contribute further to it. There are accounts, reported by various news organizations but never officially confirmed, that a previous attempt had been made to reach Al-Mabhouh, perhaps as early as 2009, possibly in another Gulf city, and that it had either been aborted or had simply failed to find its target at the right moment. If such an attempt occurred, it would have been processed in the institutional memory of both sides. For Mossad as a lesson about what additional preparation was required, for Al-Mabhouh perhaps as a signal that the threat against him was intensifying even as he continued to move, that he continued to travel, to appear in Dubai, to proceed with his procurement activities despite whatever warnings his operational experience and his intelligence contacts may have provided, suggests either extraordinary confidence in his own security measures or the kind of professional fatalism that develops in people who have spent decades operating in mortal danger and have found it possible to function only by refusing to let that danger dominate their decisions. What he did not account for or could not account for was the sheer scale of what was being prepared against him. Intelligence operations of the kind mounted in Dubai in January 2010 do not spring fully formed from moments of decision. They are built slowly, through a process that bears more resemblance to construction than to anything dramatic, layered week by week from the accumulation of small pieces of information that individually mean almost nothing and collectively begin to describe a target with increasing precision. The file on Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh had been accumulating for more than 20 years by the time the operational planning for his killing began in earnest, and the sheer depth of that archive, the cross-reference details of his movements, his contacts, his habits, his preferences in hotels and airlines and routes, provided the foundation that specific operational planning required. The process by which a name moves from a surveillance file to an active targeting package in an organization like Mossad involves multiple layers of review and authorization. At the operational level, analysts and case officers who have been working a target for years make a judgment that sufficient intelligence exists to support planning. They assess the accessibility of the target, where he appears, how often, what his security arrangements look like, what the environment is like in the places he visits. They assess the risks of action against the risks of inaction, weighing the potential exposure of an operation against the continued damage that a living target is producing. They then bring that assessment upward through the organizational hierarchy, to the division heads and eventually to the director of Mossad and, for operations of the highest sensitivity, to the political leadership of the Israeli government. Israeli law requires that the Prime Minister authorize targeted killing operations outside the occupied territories. The particular legal framework that governs these authorizations is classified and has never been publicly released in full, but the general structure is understood from the accounts of former intelligence officials and from occasional statements made by serving officials under parliamentary questioning. The authorization process involves explicit approval from the Prime Minister and oversight from the Attorney General's office, which reviews proposed operations against the government's own legal standards, essentially an internal legal check that has been developed partly in response to international criticism of the doctrine and partly from Israel's own interest in maintaining at least an internal accountability structure. Critics of the system note that all of these checks are entirely within the Israeli government itself and involve no external oversight, no judicial review by any court with genuine independence, and no notification of any international body. In the case of Al-Mabhouh, the decision to proceed almost certainly reached this authorization level well before January 2010. The specific piece of actionable intelligence that triggered the precise timing, the information that told planners he would be in Dubai in the third week of January, would have arrived through sources and methods that remain classified, but once that information was in hand, the timelines of what followed suggest that the operational machine moved quickly. The team of 27 was not improvised on short notice. The cover identities, the travel arrangements, the advanced surveillance, the hotel bookings, the equipment, all of it required preparation that takes weeks at minimum, more likely months. What the triggering intelligence provided was the specific occasion. The preparation for that occasion had been underway for considerably longer. The composition of a team of that particular size requires some explanation, because it is substantially larger than the teams typically described in accounts of previous Mossad targeted operations. The expanded scale appears to have reflected both the specific security challenges of the target and the operational philosophy applied to this particular mission. Al-Mabhouh was known to be security conscious and was understood to vary his routines. He was believed to maintain awareness of surveillance and to take active precautions against it. Meeting that challenge in a city where neither the planners nor the operatives had home field advantage, where they could not rely on the deep familiarity with the physical environment and the human networks that operations in Israel or the occupied territories would have afforded, required a larger team capable of covering multiple contingencies simultaneously. The roles within the 27 divided roughly into several functional groups. There was an advance element, operatives who arrived first and established the environmental picture, confirming that Al-Mabhouh was indeed in Dubai and tracking his initial movements from the airport. There was a surveillance element responsible for maintaining continuous eyes on the target throughout his movements in the city, following him from location to location, relaying his position in real time to a coordination function that managed the overall operation. There was a logistics and support element responsible for the practical infrastructure, the vehicles, the communications, the hotel rooms used as staging points, the acquisition and management of equipment. And there was the operational core, the small group that would actually enter Al-Mabhouh's room and carry out the killing. What made the approach particularly significant, and what generated most of the international outrage that followed, was the method used to establish the fraud. The operatives did not travel under entirely invented names. They traveled under the names of real people, real citizens of the countries whose passports they were using, most of them dual nationals who also held Israeli citizenship. This meant that the passport numbers could, in many cases, resolve against genuine records in the issuing country's systems, that the biographical details on the documents corresponded to real people who existed, who could be found, and who were entirely innocent of any involvement in what was being done in their names. When border control officers in Dubai scanned a British passport, they were scanning a document that linked, in formal database terms, to a real British subject who was almost certainly at that moment going about their entirely ordinary life somewhere in Britain or Israel with no knowledge whatsoever that their identity was being used to facilitate a killing in a Gulf hotel. The technical execution of these documents reflected capabilities that were deeply impressive regardless of one's view of their application. A forged passport that fails a visual inspection is useless. A forged passport that passes visual inspection but fails an electronic scan is worse than useless, because it triggers an alert. The documents used in Dubai pass both. They presented as genuine European passports to the visual inspection of UAE border control officers, and they resolved satisfactorily against the electronic verification systems in use at the time. Some of them, it later emerged, were sufficiently convincing that the individuals named on them had genuine difficulty convincing their own national governments that they had not personally been in Dubai on the relevant dates. The quality of the forgery was, in several cases, close to indistinguishable from the real thing. The British element of the passport operation was the largest and the most consequential diplomatically. 12 of the 27 operatives identified by Dubai investigators were traveling on British passports. The names on those passports belonged to real British citizens, most of them dual British-Israeli nationals living in Israel. When the investigation results became public and those names were released, the individuals whose identities had been used found themselves in the deeply uncomfortable position of being publicly associated with an assassination they had played no part in. British intelligence services investigating on behalf of the Foreign Office quickly established that none of them had traveled to Dubai. The inevitable conclusion was that British passport biometrics and identification details had been compromised and weaponized by a foreign intelligence service, which is to say by Israel without the knowledge or consent of the British government, the British citizens involved, or the legal framework that is supposed to govern how British travel documents operate. Australia was in a similar position. 6 operatives carried Australian passports built on the identities of real Australian citizens living in Israel. The Australian Security Intelligence Organisation and the Australian Federal Police launched an investigation that reached the same conclusion as their British counterparts. Genuine Australian citizens' details had been lifted and used without authorization. 4 operatives carried Irish passports. Several carried German and French documents. In each case, the fundamental pattern was the same: real identities, fraudulent documents, and the intelligence agencies of allied nations left to explain to their own citizens why their identities had been stolen in service of an operation the relevant government knew nothing about in advance. The use of allied nations' passport systems for Mossad operations was not unprecedented in 2010. There had been a significant controversy in 1987 when Mossad was implicated in the use of Canadian passports for an attempted operation in Jordan. In 1997, an operation in Amman that targeted Hamas political leader Khalid Meshal, a botched assassination using a chemical agent administered in a public street, had involved operatives carrying Canadian passports, causing a major diplomatic crisis that resulted in Mossad director Danny Yatom losing his position. The pattern was established enough that governments whose citizens held dual Israeli nationality had periodically raised concerns about their passport systems being tapped as a resource for Israeli operations. None of those concerns had produced a structure that prevented the Dubai operation from proceeding in exactly the way it did. The choice of which nationalities to use reflected a calculation about which documents would receive the least scrutiny at the Dubai border. British, Australian, Irish, German, and French citizens were all visa-exempt for the UAE and would be processed through the faster lanes at passport control. An Israeli passport, by contrast, would not have been accepted at all. The UAE did not at the time recognize Israeli passports and did not maintain diplomatic relations with Israel. The operatives therefore needed documents from countries whose citizens were welcome in Dubai and whose passports were globally trusted. The choice of allied Western nations rather than neutral or hostile state documentation reflected both the quality of those passports and the availability of dual nationals from whom the details could be sourced. The fact that using those passports would constitute a serious violation of the relationship between Israel and each of the countries involved was evidently weighed and accepted as a manageable cost. Behind each of the passports was a brief cover legend, a prepared story about who the traveler was and why they were visiting Dubai. Several of the operatives listed their professions as businessmen or consultants on immigration forms, innocuous enough designations for a city built on global commerce. Their declared purposes for visiting ranged from business meetings to personal travel. None of the covers were tested deeply because none needed to be. The passports passed, the forms were filled out consistently with the cover identities, and the people attached to them disappeared into the stream of tens of thousands of transit passengers moving through the terminals every day. 27 people entered Dubai on documents that were, in the formal sense, fraudulent, and not one of those documents attracted special attention as it was presented and processed at the border. The first element of the operation had succeeded completely. The operatives did not arrive in Dubai together. A group of 27 people purchasing tickets on the same flight, checking in at the same airport, and presenting documents at the same immigration booth would have produced a cluster of data points attached to the same destination that competent security services might have noticed in retrospect, even if not in the moment. Instead, the team was dispersed across several days and several points of origin, with individuals and pairs traveling on different airlines from different European cities. The arrivals spread across January 17, 18, and 19 in a pattern that presented each person to UAE border control as a separate, unconnected traveler with their own independent reason for being in Dubai at roughly the same time. The cities of departure tell part of the story on their own. Several operatives departed from European capitals, Frankfurt, Paris, Zurich, Rome, purchasing one-way or short-return tickets to Dubai that were consistent with the cover stories attached to their respective identities. Others transited through regional hubs. The departure point diversity was not accidental. It reflected the same logic that governed the passport nationality distribution. If all 27 had come from the same city, or if the booking patterns had shown a cluster of tickets purchased at the same time from related payment sources, an alert analyst working the data retrospectively might have connected the dots. The dispersion made that connection harder to draw in the short window before the operation concluded. The advanced team, the operatives who arrived earliest on January 17th, had the specific task of environmental preparation. Dubai is not a city where you can improvise. The road network, the geography of the Garhoud district where the Al Bustan Radana was located, the patterns of movement around the hotel, the camera placements on streets and intersections, the layout of the hotel lobby and corridor, the location of stairwells and service exits. All of these needed to be documented and internalized before the main surveillance phase began. The advance elements checked into hotels near the target location, conducted walking reconnaissance, and began constructing the operational picture that would guide everyone who came after them. They were also in position at Dubai International Airport when Al-Mabhouh's flight from Damascus touched down, ready to confirm the target's arrival before any other element activated. The progression of arrivals on January 18th brought most of the surveillance contingent into the city. These were the people whose job was to be invisible, to blend into the background of a busy international city in ways that left nothing memorable for anyone who might later be asked to describe what they had seen. Dubai in January is a high tourism month, the weather at its most hospitable, the hotels full of European visitors escaping northern winters and Gulf residents enjoying the relative cool. A group of tourists in casual clothes, carrying cameras and shopping bags, moving through the lobby of a business hotel or sitting at a cafe on the airport road, attracted exactly no attention at all. Several of the surveillance operatives checked into the Al Bustan Radana itself, giving the team direct, close-range access to the target's immediate environment, including the floor and corridor where he would eventually be staying. The communications architecture that connected these dispersed elements was critical and, to date, has not been fully disclosed in any open-source account. What is clear is that the team maintained real-time contact throughout the operation, relaying Al-Mabhouh's location from the moment of his confirmed arrival at the airport through his transit to the hotel and his movements within the city. This required encrypted communications devices, established protocols for signal discipline, and a coordination function, almost certainly a single individual or small group, through whom information from the surveillance elements was synthesized and redistributed to those who needed it. The level of coordination displayed across the timeline, as subsequently reconstructed by Dubai investigators, points to a communication setup of some sophistication. The hotel itself occupied a specific role in the operation's geography. The Al-Bustan Radana Garhoud was then, and remains now, a large and comfortable business hotel, the kind of establishment that catered to the executives and consultants and government officials who moved through Dubai on the commercial business of the Gulf region. It had a large lobby with multiple seating areas, a business center, several restaurants and corridors that connected the elevator banks to hundreds of rooms on multiple floors. For surveillance purposes, it offered both advantages and challenges. The large lobby provided natural cover for operatives maintaining an eye on the comings and goings of guests, while the corridor system, less frequented than public areas, required more careful management to keep eyes on a specific floor without attracting attention from staff or other guests. The outer ring of 27 provided redundancy and cover. If a surveillance operative was burned, noticed by the target or identified to local security, they could be replaced or withdrawn without compromising the inner operation. If the target changed hotels or altered his schedule, the larger network could adapt and reposition. The scale was an insurance policy against the kind of individual-level failures that could abort or expose a smaller operation. It was also, as the subsequent investigation would demonstrate with merciless clarity, a vulnerability. With 27 people moving through a city with comprehensive camera coverage, the operational exposure was massively greater than a smaller team would have created. The decision to prioritize redundancy over minimal footprint would prove, from the standpoint of concealment, to be the operation's single greatest miscalculation. The operatives themselves were, by the available accounts, highly trained professionals drawn from Mossad's operational cadre. The specific details of their backgrounds and institutional affiliations have never been officially disclosed, but the technical and physical demands of the operation they executed, sustained mobile surveillance across a foreign city, covert hotel entry, the administration of a pharmacological agent in a controlled setting, and a coordinated withdrawal from the country within hours of completion, point unambiguously to people with extensive specialized training in exactly these disciplines. Several of those subsequently identified through Dubai's investigation appeared to have had experience in security or military backgrounds based on the inferences investigators drew from their behavior patterns captured on camera. The operational command structure almost certainly placed a case officer or team leader in overall coordination, probably operating from a position inside the hotel or a nearby location from which communications could be managed in real time. Below that, each functional element had its own designated lead. Communications between elements were almost certainly conducted through encrypted devices using protocols designed to minimize the risk of interception, though the exact technical means used remain undisclosed. The precision of the subsequent timeline, the way each element moved in relation to the others with a degree of synchronization that left almost no visible gap, speaks to a level of coordination that does not happen without both rigorous planning and practiced execution. What the planning process would also have included, with particular care, was the exit strategy. The greatest operational risk in a mission of this kind is not the killing itself but the period immediately following it, the window between the completion of the action and the departure of all operatives from the country. Dubai's busy airport infrastructure, with multiple daily flights to dozens of destinations, provided good options. The plan, as subsequently reconstructed from camera footage, appears to have been to disperse the team through at least 3 separate airports within the UAE and immediately surrounding region, with operatives leaving in small groups on flights to different European cities beginning within hours of the operation's completion. The coordination required to manage 27 departures across multiple airports while avoiding any concentration that might attract attention was itself a substantial logistical achievement. By the time all of this preparation existed and the specific date in January had been confirmed as the execution window, the operation had moved from the realm of intelligence assessment to the realm of physical reality. A team existed. Identities existed. Passports were in hands. Hotel rooms were booked. The target was confirmed in transit. What happened next was no longer a question of whether but only of when, measured in hours rather than months. A passport is one of the most consequential documents a modern state produces, a physical certificate of identity and citizenship that unlocks the global movement of people and serves as the primary instrument through which border authorities distinguish between those who belong and those who do not. For the intelligence agencies of states engaged in covert operations, the passport presents both an essential tool and a persistent problem. Operatives must cross borders. Border crossings require documents. Documents create records. Records can be traced. The solution to this problem, pursued by virtually every intelligence service that conducts operations in foreign countries, is the false passport, a document that appears genuine because it is built on a real identity rather than a fabricated one, because it carries the correct security features of the issuing nation, and because it presents at a checkpoint the appearance of a real person with a legitimate reason for travel. The false passport operation that underpinned the Dubai mission was, by the standards of those familiar with such things, extraordinarily ambitious. The 27 operatives who arrived in Dubai did not all carry documents from a single country. Israeli intelligence had constructed an operation in which passports from 6 different countries were represented: the United Kingdom, Australia, Ireland, France, and Germany, with some operatives also reportedly carrying passports from other European nations. This distribution served a specific operational logic. A group of 27 people all arriving from the same country, or all carrying the same nationality, creates a statistical pattern that even moderately alert border security might notice. Spreading the nationalities across multiple countries reduced that pattern and made each individual arrival look demographically unremarkable. The specific detail that at least several operatives actually checked into the Al Bustan Radana, confirmed by the subsequent analysis of hotel records, meant that the team had a legitimate physical presence in the building that justified their movement through its spaces. They had room keys. They had floors to be on. They had reasons, if anyone asked, for being in the corridors or the elevator lobbies. This kind of in-facility cover is a standard element of surveillance operations in hotel environments, and its use here reflected the thoroughness of the planning. Nothing was left to chance in the initial positioning. January 19th brought the final wave of arrivals, including operatives who had roles in the execution element of the operation, the people who would actually enter room 230. By the time Al-Mabhouh's taxi pulled into the hotel's driveway at around 8:30 in the morning, all or nearly all the team was in position. The surveillance network was active. The communications were functioning. The preliminary phase had been completed without any apparent breach of security. The advance work had done its job. Al-Mabhouh's arrival was confirmed to the coordination element within minutes of his stepping out of the taxi. The surveillance team in the lobby watched him approach the front desk, noted his body language, confirmed his identity against the description and photographs in their operational brief. He was as described. He behaved as expected, calm, deliberate, showing none of the heightened alertness that would have indicated he had any awareness of the net being drawn around him. He took his room key, rode the elevator to the second floor, and disappeared into his room. What he would do next, where he would go, who he would meet, all of this had been anticipated in the operational planning, but none of it could be known with certainty until it happened. The surveillance element shifted from confirmation mode to tracking mode, and the patient, professional work of following a man without his knowledge through his last day alive began. The coordination challenge of keeping 27 people from stepping on each other's operational toes in a space as confined as a single hotel and its immediate surroundings was significant. In a large city with dispersed surveillance positions, team members can operate at comfortable distances from each other and from the target, the physical separation itself providing a degree of natural deniability. In a hotel, the distances collapsed. Operatives maintaining surveillance on the second-floor corridor were in the same physical space as the cleaning staff, the occasionally passing guest, the maintenance worker. The management of those proximities, knowing when to stay and when to withdraw, when to make eye contact and when to look away, was the kind of judgment call that separated genuinely skilled field operatives from those who merely possessed the right technical training. The people deployed to Dubai in January 2010 appear to have been, by the available evidence, genuinely skilled. They moved through the hotel and the city with what surveillance cameras would later confirm was a practiced naturalness, presenting a surface of ordinary tourist and business behavior that gave no one watching in real time any reason to think twice. The cameras, of course, did not need to think twice in real time. They only needed to record. And they recorded everything. The Al Bustan Rotana Garhoud sits in a part of Dubai that occupies a middle distance between the dramatic futurism of the city's showpiece districts and the older, more functional industrial zone near the airport. The hotel stands close to the creek that separates Dara from Bur Dubai, in a neighborhood that developed primarily as a service hub for the airport trade, business travelers, airline crew, transit passengers requiring a few hours or a night before continuing to their destinations. It is not a grand hotel in the way that the properties along the marina or near the Burj Khalifa might be described as grand. It is a hotel of considerable quality, clean and well-run and professionally staffed, that offers exactly what its clientele requires without pretension. In January 2010, its grounds included manicured gardens, a pool that reflected the winter sky, and a lobby that received a constant flow of guests whose business in Dubai covered the full spectrum of the commercial and official activity that the city facilitates. The hotel's corridors on the upper floors would have looked familiar to any business traveler. Cream-colored walls, carpeted floors with a geometric pattern in muted tones, doors spaced at regular intervals with their electronic lock panels and do not disturb hooks. A housekeeping cart parked at the far end of a corridor on a Tuesday morning. The faint sound of a television through a closed door. The smell of cleaning products and the faint floral undertone of whatever scent the hotel pumped through its ventilation system. Room 230 was on the second floor, a standard room with a view over the hotel garden rather than the road, equipped with the bed and desk and armchair and flat-screen television that constituted the universal grammar of the International Business Hotel room. It was not special. It was replaceable with 1,000 other rooms in 100 other cities. What made it distinctive on January 19, 2010 was only the man who occupied it. Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh's day began in that room, and the sequence of his movements over the following hours was observed, recorded, and relayed in real time by the surveillance network that had been positioned around him. He left the hotel on at least one occasion during the day. The precise details of where he went and whom he met remain partially reconstructed from subsequent investigation rather than fully confirmed from open sources, but it is established that he had business in Dubai beyond merely occupying the room, that he met with contacts related to the procurement activities that had brought him there, and that he returned to the hotel in the early afternoon. The surveillance maintained contact with him throughout these movements, tracking him through the hotel lobby and to whatever transportation he used, maintaining the thread without losing it. By early afternoon, Al-Mabhouh was back at the Al Bustan Rotana. He had addressed whatever business had brought him to Dubai that morning. He returned to room 230, and at some point between his return and the discovery of his body the following day, the team moved. The mechanism of entry into a secured hotel room is one of the more practically challenging aspects of a hotel-based assassination operation. Simply knocking on the door and forcing entry is a high-risk approach that creates noise, physical evidence of a struggle, and witnesses if the corridor happens not to be empty at that moment. The preferred methodology for professional operations in hotel environments involves some form of access to a working room key, which can be obtained in several ways depending on the specific hotel systems and the resources available to the team. Dubai investigators concluded, from their examination of the hotel's electronic access records, that the door to room 230 was opened at a specific point in the early evening using a key card that should not have been in the possession of anyone other than Al-Mabhouh and the hotel staff. The precise method by which that access was obtained has not been publicly confirmed in full detail. What the investigators established with more confidence was the sequence of events outside the room in the period leading up to the fatal entry. Camera footage from the hotel corridor and elevator areas captured the movement of operatives, dressed casually in the clothing consistent with their cover as hotel guests, in the vicinity of room 230 in the period before and during the timeline of the killing. At least 2 operatives were captured on camera taking the elevator to the second floor at the relevant time. Others were positioned in the corridor, appearing to be ordinary guests. The operational choreography of managing the corridor during the entry, ensuring no unexpected witness appeared at the wrong moment, providing cover for the individuals entering the room, was executed with the precision that the rest of the operation had displayed. Inside room 230, the killing was done with a pharmacological agent. This detail, established through the post-mortem examination conducted by Dubai forensic specialists, is one of the most significant technical facts of the entire case because it speaks directly to the sophistication of what was deployed. The specific agent used has been the subject of various reports and expert assessments, and while no single account has been definitively confirmed through official disclosure, the forensic findings pointed to the use of a compound that induces rapid incapacitation, potentially a succinylcholine-based muscle relaxant or similar neuromuscular blocking agent, combined with physical suffocation. The agent, when administered in sufficient concentration, paralyzes the voluntary muscles, including the respiratory system. A person who receives such an agent loses the ability to resist, loses the ability to breathe on their own, and can be killed while leaving very limited forensic evidence of the specific mechanism if the body is handled correctly afterward. The staging of the room to suggest a natural death was part of the execution protocol. Al-Mabhouh was found in a position and a condition consistent with someone who had died in their sleep. Lying in bed, the room apparently undisturbed, no obvious signs of violence. The door had been locked from the inside, or appeared to have been locked from the inside, creating the initial impression that no one else had been present. The combination of these factors led the hotel staff who first discovered his body to call not for the police but for a medical team, and the initial response treated the situation as a medical rather than criminal matter. That initial assessment bought the operatives time they had almost certainly counted on in their planning. By the time anyone began to question whether Al-Mabhouh's death was what it appeared to be, the people responsible were already at the airport. The actual killing did not take long. For a man who had spent 20 years as a hunted person, who had survived at least one previous attempt on his life, who had constructed precautions and varied habits and moved between identities, for all of that history and all of that accumulated experience, the end came in a hotel room in Dubai in a matter of minutes, without a fight, without an alarm, without any of the noise that might have defined the killing of a man who had spent his career in violence. The paradox of his end was its quietness. He had lived a loud and dangerous life in the service of an organization that expressed itself through bombs and rockets and the organized killing of its enemies. He died on a clean hotel bedsheet in a room that looked, from the outside and from the inside and in the official photographs taken the next morning, like nothing unusual at all had occurred there. The team that did it was gone before his body was cold. There is a version of January 19, 2010 that can be reconstructed from the surveillance footage, the hotel records, the travel manifests, and the accounts of investigators who spent months assembling a minute-by-minute picture of what happened on that day. That reconstruction never captured the interior experience of any of its subjects. The precise thoughts of a man who had no reason to believe his life was ending, the controlled focus of trained operatives executing a plan they had rehearsed to exhaustion, the particular tension of waiting in a corridor while time moves at the speed it always moves outside of the moments that compress and expand around irreversible actions. What the reconstruction captured was the external form. Where people were, when they moved, what sequences of events preceded what other sequences. It is a map of a day, not a biography of it. Al-Mabhouh's travel from Damascus to Dubai had been on an Emirates flight routed through the standard commercial schedule. He sat in economy class, which was the choice of a man who traveled frequently enough on operational budgets that comfort was secondary to not drawing attention. The flight took approximately 2.5 hours. He arrived, as recorded, at 8:25 in the morning. The advance element of the team at the airport confirmed his arrival and triggered the notification chain. From that moment, someone in the surveillance network had eyes on him or knowledge of his position for essentially the rest of the day. After checking into the Al Bustan Rotana late in the morning, Al-Mabhouh left the hotel for a period of several hours. The investigators who later reconstructed his movements established that he met with at least one associate in Dubai during this window. The details of those meetings, the people he saw and what was discussed, remain incompletely documented in the public record, though Hamas sources confirmed after his death that he had been engaged in operational business relating to the weapons procurement pipeline. Whatever the meeting produced, it appears to have concluded without incident. He returned to the hotel. The surveillance team or its rotating elements tracked these movements. Several operatives had been positioned outside the hotel and in the surrounding streets, and the coordination function received updates as Al-Mabhouh moved. The Dubai footage would later show members of the team in a taxi in the vicinity of the hotel during the period he was outside it, consistent with vehicle-based mobile surveillance. When he returned, his re-entry into the hotel's lobby was noted, and the team adjusted its positioning accordingly. Elements that had been holding at a distance during his absence moved back into their positions around the second floor. The afternoon produced a specific sequence that became one of the most analyzed pieces of the Dubai investigation. Camera footage from the hotel's internal system captured a brief but notable incident in the early afternoon. Al-Mabhouh, returning to the elevator lobby from the lobby proper, encountered two men in the elevator area who appeared, upon later analysis, to be members of the surveillance team. The three men stood in proximity for the seconds it took the elevator to arrive, and then Al-Mabhouh entered the elevator while the two men did not. Both remained in the lobby area, appearing to use their phones. To anyone watching in real time, it was the completely unremarkable interaction of hotel guests in close physical proximity for a brief moment. Al-Mabhouh gave no indication of heightened alertness. He pressed his floor and the doors closed. But the investigators who reviewed that footage later, knowing what they knew by then about who those men were, noted something in their posture and their subsequent movement that suggested the moment had a purpose. The two men, after the elevator doors closed, moved toward an exit and made phone calls. The timing of those communications relative to what happened next was consistent with confirmation signals. The relay of the confirmation that the target was in the elevator heading to his floor and that the operational sequence should proceed. This interpretation cannot be verified with certainty from the footage alone, and the two men were never publicly identified with enough specificity for the inference to be tested against any other source. But the sequence fits the operational logic of a team moving from standby to active status. In the corridor outside room 230, sometime between mid-afternoon and early evening, the number of people present or proximate increased. Cameras captured individuals in the corridor who had also been captured at various points earlier in the day in the hotel lobby and on the second floor. These were not passing guests. Their patterns of movement, when analyzed over the full day's footage, showed them returning to the same area multiple times without the luggage, food, or purpose-based movement that would explain such repetition for ordinary hotel guests. They were there because that was where their job required them to be. The door to room 230 was opened at some point during this window. The electronic access records for the room, which registered every activation of the door's lock system, became one of the key pieces of evidence in the subsequent investigation. Those records showed an entry that could not be accounted for by Al-Mabhouh's own keycard use. The manner in which this secondary entry was accomplished, the technical means by which a duplicate keycard was obtained or created, has never been fully confirmed in the public record. Various investigators and security experts have hypothesized about the method, including the possibility of a master key obtained through compromise of a hotel staff member, the exploitation of a technical vulnerability in the hotel's door management system, or the use of a device capable of reading and cloning the RFID signal of an existing card. All of these methods exist and are known to intelligence services. The specific method used in Dubai on January 19th remains, officially, undisclosed. What is known is that at some point in the early evening, Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh was alone in room 230, and the door to that room was opened by people who had no business being inside it. He was not carrying a weapon. He had no warning. Whatever personal security precautions he normally maintained had been insufficient to register the threat in time to act on it. The speed and efficiency of what followed, the administration of the incapacitating agent, the suffocation, the positioning of the body, and the staging of the room, left forensic investigators uncertain at first that anything other than a natural cardiac event had occurred. That ambiguity was the point. The operation had been planned not just to kill Al-Mabhouh, but to kill him in a way that bought the operatives as much time as possible before anyone understood what had actually happened. By the time room 230 was quiet again and its door was closed from the outside, leaving behind only what appeared to be a man who had died peacefully in bed, the clock was already running. The team had hours, perhaps a full day or more if the staging held, before anyone would begin to look for them in the way they needed to be looked for. Those hours were the resource the entire operation had been designed to create and protect. The team had everything it needed to disappear. The departure from Dubai began while the city was still fully awake. January 19th had been a Tuesday, and Tuesday evenings in Dubai have the particular quality of a city that never entirely stops. Flights departing well into the early morning hours. The airport's terminals humming at the reduced but never fully quiet pace of a hub that serves dozens of airlines across 6 continents. The operatives had not lingered. Within hours of the operation in room 230, the departure sequence was already underway, the individual elements of the team peeling away from their positions in the hotel and the surrounding streets and moving toward the exits they had identified in advance. They did not all leave from the same airport, and this was not accidental. Dubai International handles the majority of international departures, but the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, a short drive away, has its own international airport, and the Emirate of Sharjah has a smaller but functional hub as well. Spreading the departures across multiple airports was the same instinct that had governed the arrival strategy. The goal of preventing the appearance of a cluster, the dispersal of data points into a pattern too diffuse to resolve clearly in a short time frame. Several operatives departed through Dubai International itself, booking onto flights to various European cities on airlines whose schedules provided the tightest connection between the completion of the operation and the earliest available departure. Others traveled by road to Abu Dhabi and departed from there. The cities they flew to reflected the same nationality distribution as the passports they were carrying. Operatives carrying British documents flew to London. Those with Australian papers took routes consistent with Australians returning home or transiting through European hubs. French and German operatives departed on routes appropriate to those nationalities. The diversity of destinations made each departure look, to the airline staff and gate agents and the automated systems that process boarding passes, like ordinary international travel. Nobody was stopping someone named on a British passport from boarding a flight to London. Nobody had any reason to. The timing of the departures, relative to the killing, has been established through the flight records that Dubai investigators later assembled. At least one group of operatives was at the airport departures terminal within 2 hours of the operation's completion. The last members of the team appear to have departed Dubai by the following morning, before Al-Mabhouh's body was found. This meant that when room 230 was opened and the alarm was raised and Dubai police began trying to understand what had happened, not a single member of the team remained in the UAE. They had been on the ground for as long as the operation required and for not a minute longer than that. The physical act of leaving a hotel without attracting attention after participating in a killing in that same building requires a specific kind of controlled composure that speaks to training. The instinct of anyone in a genuinely stressful situation, and killing a person, however professionally it is conducted, generates physiological stress, is to move with the urgency that stress produces, to look around more than usual, to interact with service staff in ways that reflect distraction or heightened energy. The operatives who checked out of the Al Bustan Rotana and the other hotels where the team had been based did none of these things to a degree that attracted any notice from the staff who processed their departures. They settled their bills, returned their keys, carried their luggage through lobbies that had cameras pointed at them, and presented the same surface of ordinary business travel that they had maintained throughout their stay. None of them was stopped. None of them was questioned. They moved through the hotel checkouts with the practiced ordinariness of people who had been trained extensively for exactly this kind of controlled exit. At the airports, the same discipline held. The departure halls of international airports have cameras in quantities comparable to the arrivals halls, and the process of checking in, passing through security, navigating to a gate, and boarding a flight provides multiple points at which a person who is behaving unusually might be flagged. The operatives moved through these stages without incident. Boarding passes were scanned. Passports were checked a final time by gate staff. Bodies went through security screening in the standard way. Luggage was checked, when checked at all, without producing anything that generated an alert. And then they stepped onto their flights, slid into their seats, accepted whatever was offered by the cabin crew, and lifted into the night sky above the Gulf. The operational security discipline that managed the departure phase reflected the same quality of planning that had characterized everything else. The exit protocol had been designed with the assumption that the team needed to be out of UAE jurisdiction before anyone identified Al-Mabhouh's death as a murder rather than a natural death. The staging of Room 230 was intended to create a delay of hours, possibly more, and that delay, combined with the advanced positioning of departure routes, meant the window should have been sufficient. In the event, it was more than sufficient. The team was gone before anyone had correctly identified what had actually happened in that hotel room, and the collective advantage they had built through tight planning and practiced execution was preserved intact all the way to the point of departure. What none of them could have planned for, what no amount of operational sophistication could have fully anticipated, was the depth and permanence of what they were leaving behind. Not physical evidence in the hotel room, not witnesses who had noticed something specific enough to report. What they were leaving behind was data, an enormous, meticulous, time-stamped archive of data captured by a camera infrastructure so comprehensive and so well-maintained that it had, without any human being specifically directing it toward them, recorded every significant movement of every member of the team across every relevant location in Dubai over the preceding 3 days. Room entry times, elevator moments, lobby interactions, taxi departures, airport check-in positions. The cameras of Dubai had been watching 27 people execute an operation with professional precision, and all of that watching had been silently preserved in systems that would eventually be handed to investigators. The operatives who flew out of Dubai in the hours after January 19th did not know the full extent of what those cameras held. They knew Dubai had cameras. Any operational planning for a modern city had to account for cameras. But the specific density, coverage, and archival reliability of Dubai's system may not have been fully appreciated, because what that system ultimately produced was not just fragments but a near-complete reconstruction of the operation from arrival to departure, and that reconstruction would eventually put names to faces and put faces to passports and put passports to embassies and put embassies to governments, and trigger a diplomatic crisis that reached London, Canberra, Dublin, Paris, and Berlin and produced the most public and detailed account of a Mossad operation that has ever been assembled through open investigation. The clean exit was real. The operatives got away. But what they left behind them was a trail that a team of determined investigators would spend months following to its end. The morning of January 20th, 2010 was an ordinary Wednesday in Dubai, the city proceeding through the middle of its working week with the characteristic energy of a place that does not stop for much. At the Al Bustan Ratana, the housekeeping staff began their morning rounds at the usual time, pushing their carts along the corridors of the second floor with the practiced efficiency of people who have performed the same sequence hundreds of times. The Do Not Disturb signs were checked first, as procedure required. Room 230 had no such sign on its door. The housekeeper knocked. Standard knock, standard pause, standard second knock with the verbal announcement that housekeeping was present. No response. She inserted her electronic key card, announced her presence again as the door opened, and pushed it inward. The curtains in the room were still drawn. The air conditioning was running at its overnight setting, keeping the room cool in the way that Gulf hotel rooms are kept when their occupants prefer sleeping in cold air. And in the bed, under the covers, lay the man who had checked in the previous morning under the name listed in the Syrian travel document. He appeared to be sleeping. He was very still. The housekeeper called his name. No response. She stepped closer and saw what the body's absolute stillness and the color of his skin told her without any possible ambiguity. She backed out of the room and notified the front desk. The hotel's response followed the protocol designed for this situation, which was medical rather than investigative. A guest had apparently died during the night. The hotel manager was notified. Dubai's emergency medical services were called. A doctor arrived, examined the body, and determined that the man was dead. At this stage, the working assumption was natural causes. Al-Mabhouh was in his early 50s, heavy-set, and had been found in a position and condition entirely consistent with cardiac arrest during sleep. The room showed no obvious signs of disturbance. There was no forced entry evidence visible to the initial responders. The staging that had been executed the night before was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Dubai police were notified, as they are for any death in a hotel, the standard procedure regardless of the apparent cause. A police officer arrived and took the initial report. The identity documents found in the room were noted. The death was recorded as apparently natural. The body was transported to a Dubai hospital for formal certification. For a period of hours on January 20th, it appeared that Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh had simply died in his sleep in a hotel room, and the world had not noticed. Hamas noticed. The organization maintaining contact with Al-Mabhouh had expected him to check in after his business in Dubai was completed and had received no communication. When the silence extended past the point that was consistent with his normal operational patterns, inquiries began through whatever backchannels connected Hamas's external operations to people in the Gulf. Those inquiries eventually reached the confirmation that a man matching Al-Mabhouh's description had been found dead in a Dubai hotel. And from that point, Hamas moved with a speed that reflected both grief and strategic calculation. Within hours of learning of his death, the organization publicly declared that Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh had been assassinated, and they did so in terms that pointed the accusation directly at Israel and specifically at Mossad. Hamas's public statement did two things simultaneously. First, it transformed the Dubai police's medical case into something they could no longer categorize as a natural death investigation. A senior Hamas military official, publicly identified, had died in a Dubai hotel, and a political organization with deep intelligence connections had characterized it as an assassination by a foreign intelligence service. That required a different response. Second, Hamas's statement provided context for the identity of the dead man. Not the name on his Syrian document, but his real identity as one of the most senior figures in the organization's military wing. This context made his death politically explosive in ways that a man dying under an assumed name in a Gulf hotel would never otherwise have been. Dubai's police force, under the command of Lieutenant General Dahi Khalfan Tamim, pivoted from a routine medical inquiry to a murder investigation. The pivot was immediate and total. Dahi Khalfan was not a figure who approached provocations on his territory with restraint. He was a senior Emirati official with long experience in both security and public communication, and he would prove over the following weeks to be one of the most relentless and publicly forthright investigators of any intelligence operation in recent memory. He did not work quietly behind closed doors and release careful diplomatic statements. He briefed the press. He described the evidence. He named names. He leveled accusations. And he had, behind him, an evidentiary record that justified every word. The first task facing the investigators once the death was reclassified was the post-mortem examination. A forensic pathologist at the Dubai hospital where Al-Mabhouh's body had been taken conducted a second examination under criminal investigation protocols. That examination produced the findings that would define the investigation. The cause of death was not cardiac arrest. There were physical signs consistent with the administration of a neuromuscular blocking agent and with subsequent asphyxiation, specifically petechial hemorrhaging and other markers that distinguished oxygen deprivation caused by external obstruction from the internal failure of a natural death. The staging had been careful and professionally executed, but it had not been flawless. Or perhaps the Dubai pathologist was simply skilled enough to find what had been left to find. With a confirmed homicide and the identity of the victim established, the investigation required an account of who had been in contact with Al-Mabhouh and who had been in the vicinity of room 230 on the evening of January 19th. And for that, the investigators turned to the cameras. What they found in those camera archives was, by the account of every investigator and journalist who later reviewed the process, extraordinary in its completeness. Dubai's surveillance infrastructure had been built over the preceding years with a comprehensiveness driven partly by the security requirements of a state that takes public order very seriously and partly by the commercial logic of a tourism and business hub that needed to be able to assure major international visitors of their safety. The camera coverage of Dubai International Airport, of the major hotels and their approaches, of the principal roads and intersections linking them, of the public spaces through which the population and its visitors moved. It was dense, well-maintained, and reliably archived. The archives did not degrade. The timestamps were accurate. The resolution was sufficient to establish identity in many cases without additional comparison material. And into that archive, 27 people had unknowingly deposited a complete record of everything they had done. The investigation that Dubai's General Department of State Security and the Dubai Police Force mounted in the weeks following January 20, 2010 was, by the standards of any comparable inquiry, extraordinary in both its speed and its systematic thoroughness. The investigators understood from the beginning that what they were dealing with was not an ordinary homicide. A Hamas commander had been killed in a Gulf hotel by persons unknown, using methods that required medical expertise and specialized materials. The political dimensions of the case were obvious and immediate. The resources brought to bear on the investigation reflected those dimensions. The camera work began at Dubai International Airport and worked forward in time from Al-Mabhouh's confirmed arrival on the morning of January 19th. Investigators pulled the airport footage first, because the airport was the point at which every person entering the country had been recorded in full-face resolution at passport control. Al-Mabhouh's arrival was there. A man presenting a Syrian document at 8:25 in the morning, captured from multiple angles by the immigration hall cameras. And behind him, arriving separately, in ones and twos over the preceding 2 days, were 27 other people whose presence at the scene of a murder would need to be explained. Identifying them required cross-referencing the airport footage against the hotel footage against the passport records against the flight manifests. For each of the 27, the investigators built an individual timeline. When they entered the UAE, what document they presented, where they went from the airport, which hotel they checked into, what their movements were according to the camera record, when they departed, and where they flew. For an investigation team with access to the UAE's centralized data systems and the cooperation of the relevant state agencies. This cross-referencing was complex but achievable. Produced, progressively, a picture of staggering clarity. The hotel footage was the most revealing element after the airport records. Al-Bustan Rotana's internal camera system had recorded, across January 17, 18, and 19, the faces and movements of multiple individuals who could be cross-referenced against the airport records to establish their identities. Several of these individuals had been captured in positions and at times relative to room 230 that were inexplicable by any mechanism other than involvement in the killing. The camera outside the elevator lobby on the second floor showed the sequence of arrivals and departures in the corridor. The lobby cameras showed the surveillance elements maintaining their positions. The footage from the surrounding streets showed the vehicle-based elements tracking Al-Mabhouh's movements during the day. Lieutenant General Dahi Khalfan announced the first results of the investigation at a press conference in early February 2010, less than 3 weeks after Al-Mabhouh's body had been found. He presented photographs. Surveillance camera stills of 11 individuals initially identified, their faces drawn from the airport and hotel footage, their identities matched against the passport documents they had used. The photographs were distributed internationally. Journalists in Australia, Britain, and Ireland recognized that the names on the passports corresponded to real people living in those countries. And when those journalists contacted the named individuals, they found without exception people who had never been anywhere near Dubai and had no idea their identities had been used. The press conference set in motion a chain of revelations that unfolded over the following weeks as the investigation results were progressively expanded and shared with the affected governments. By late February, the number of confirmed operatives in the Dubai investigation had risen from the initial 11 to 26. Eventually, it would reach 27. Each new face released produced the same pattern. A passport name drawn from a real person, a confirmed non-presence in Dubai on the relevant dates, and an inference about the country that had organized the operation that became clearer with each additional name. The footage that Dubai's investigators ultimately made public became some of the most widely viewed surveillance footage in the history of modern intelligence affairs. International news channels broadcast it in extended segments, not just freeze frames but actual video, showing operatives in their tennis outfits and baseball caps and business casual clothing moving through hotel lobbies and elevator halls with a purpose that, now that the context was understood, looked entirely different from the innocent transit imagery it had been mistaken for by everyone who had seen it in real time. The scenes of multiple operatives converging on a floor of the Al-Bustan Rotana on the evening of January 19th were accompanied by the kind of editorial commentary that placed them firmly within the vocabulary of professional espionage. The Dubai investigators' reconstruction was meticulous in ways that went beyond simply identifying who was present. They established the communication structure of the team by analyzing the patterns of mobile phone use around the key events captured on camera. They documented the use of what appeared to be encrypted or modified communications devices. They identified the vehicles used for mobile surveillance and traced them to rental companies. They interviewed hotel staff and others who had been in proximity to the operatives and found, as might have been expected, that no one had noticed anything unusual at all, which was itself a form of confirmation that the team had executed its cover with skill. What the investigation could not establish through open means was the command structure above the operatives. No one in Dubai at the time of the operation appeared to correspond to a central command figure of sufficient seniority to have authorized the mission. The planners, the decision-makers, the authorization chain that ran up through whatever organizational hierarchy had ordered the killing, none of this appeared in the Dubai camera record because none of those people had been in Dubai. They had been somewhere else, watching from a distance through whatever reporting came back to them, and their connection to what happened in room 230 existed only in classified communications and institutional knowledge that no Dubai investigation could reach. Dahi Khalfan did not wait for that evidence before making his accusation. By the time the investigation had been running for several weeks, he was publicly and repeatedly identifying Mossad as the organization responsible. He named the Israeli intelligence service in terms that described a certainty rather than a hypothesis. He called for international arrest warrants. He described the operation as a violation of UAE sovereignty of the gravest kind. He demanded Israeli accountability through diplomatic channels. He made statements that his own government later chose to manage more carefully, but which he personally never retracted. The accumulated evidence of the investigation, he was clear, left him in no doubt about who had ordered and executed the killing of Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh. The question of what could actually be done about it was a different matter altogether. Interpol red notices were issued for the 27 identified operatives. The notices were formally correct. They were filed against the names on the passports the operatives had been using, and those names attached to real people who were not, of course, the actual operatives. The practical effect of the red notices was therefore largely symbolic, a formal expression of the UAE's position that a crime had been committed and that those responsible should be held to account. The operatives themselves, whoever they were and wherever they had returned to, would have read those notices with the knowledge that neither the name nor the country of origin attached to each notice corresponded to any real identifying information about them. They were, from a formal legal pursuit standpoint, effectively beyond reach. This was, in its own way, the last element of operational cover, not physical concealment but legal concealment, the protection of false identity extending beyond the operation itself into the formal machinery of international law enforcement. The team had entered Dubai under false names and exited under false names, and the legal record of the killing pointed at those same false names indefinitely. The real people were somewhere that no Interpol notice would find them. The British government's response began quietly long before it became public. When the investigation results produced the first set of names and those names were checked against British records, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the relevant intelligence services understood immediately what they were looking at. 12 British passport numbers. 12 genuine British citizens. 12 people whose biographical details had been extracted, almost certainly from the passport database accessible to Israelis holding dual British-Israeli citizenship, and used to construct fraudulent travel documents for an assassination operation. The Foreign Office's immediate private communications to the Israeli government were urgent in the way that communications about fundamental breaches of trust between intelligence allies are urgent. Not public, not immediately escalatory, but absolutely unambiguous about the gravity of the situation. There is a specific kind of relationship that exists between Israel and several Western governments, particularly the United Kingdom and Australia, that is built on decades of intelligence cooperation, aligned strategic interests, and a web of institutional ties that connect security services on multiple levels. Both countries have historically maintained the kind of relationship with Mossad that their own populations know little about and that their governments discuss even less. The use of those countries' passport systems for a unilateral operation carried out without notification or consent was, within the framework of that relationship, an act of extraordinary presumption, the equivalent of a trusted ally using your house as a staging point for their own operation without asking permission. The private response reflected that, even if the initial public statements were managed carefully. Australia's situation carried its own particular history. In 2004, New Zealand had arrested 2 Mossad operatives who had attempted to fraudulently obtain a New Zealand passport in the name of a disabled man. The investigation had produced a formal diplomatic sanction, a public apology from Israel, and a period of suspended intelligence relations between the 2 countries. Australia had been watching that incident as a precedent and had raised concerns with Israel over the years about the security of Australian passport data. The 2010 Dubai operation, which involved 6 Australian passports, suggested those concerns had produced no durable change in Israeli practice. The Australian Federal Police investigation confirmed within months what the Dubai inquiry was already showing. 6 real Australians' details, used without their knowledge, in a killing on Emirati soil. The Irish government was particularly emphatic in its response because of Ireland's specific international legal and political positioning. Ireland is not a member of any military alliance and has a tradition of formal neutrality that shapes both its foreign policy and its public culture. The implication that Irish passports had been used for an assassination operation was, from the perspective of Irish diplomacy, among the most serious possible violations of the trust embedded in the travel document system. Foreign Affairs Minister Michael Martin stated in the Dáil that the misuse of Irish passports was a violation of Irish sovereignty and of the rights of the Irish citizens whose identities had been stolen. An Irish intelligence investigation confirmed the forgeries with the same result as the British and Australian inquiries. The individuals named on the Irish documents were found, interviewed, and confirmed to have had no presence in Dubai. France and Germany were quieter in their public responses but no less direct in their private ones. Both countries' intelligence services and foreign ministries conducted investigations and reached the same conclusions. The German Foreign Ministry summoned the Israeli ambassador. The French government communicated its position through diplomatic channels in terms that were not subsequently made fully public but were understood to be strongly worded. The pattern was consistent across all 5 affected Western nations. A confirmed breach of passport security by a foreign intelligence service, directed at the identities of the affected nation's own citizens, for a purpose, killing someone in a third country, that none of those governments had authorized, endorsed, or been informed of. Israel's public response was a masterclass in calibrated non-denial. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and senior government officials made no formal acknowledgement that Israel had been involved in the Dubai operation. No Israeli official said, in terms, that Mossad was responsible. At the same time, no Israeli official issued a flat denial. When pressed in parliamentary sessions and media appearances, the response was consistently the same formulation. Israel does not discuss such matters. Israel operates according to its legal framework. Israel is studying the reports. The non-denial denial, practiced in this way, manages to preserve a formal deniability while communicating to everyone capable of reading diplomatic signals that there is, in fact, nothing to deny that would be credible. The governments of Britain, Australia, and the others received no apology, no admission, no assurance that the practice would not be repeated, and no full accounting of what had occurred. What each affected government did receive, eventually, was a highly confidential briefing from Israeli intelligence officials that contained the kind of private acknowledgement that the public posture made impossible. The precise content of those briefings has not been disclosed, but the subsequent diplomatic actions of the affected governments give some indication of their tenor. Britain expelled an Israeli diplomat from London and introduced new screening procedures for Israeli passport applications to reduce the risk of dual nationals' British passport data being compromised in future. Australia similarly expelled an Israeli diplomat and introduced enhanced monitoring of its passport database, including new controls on dual nationals. Ireland, Germany, and France took their own measures. None of these responses produced a complete rupture of the underlying intelligence relationships, which had survived previous strains and which served strategic purposes that no single incident, however inflammatory, was likely to permanently sever. The expelled diplomats were, in the nomenclature of these situations, intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, a standard practice among the intelligence services of virtually all major nations and one that provides the expelling country with a targeted way to signal displeasure while stopping short of the complete diplomatic break that would be a much more serious escalation. An expulsion sends a message. It does not end a relationship. The Israeli embassy in London continued to function. Israeli intelligence and British intelligence continued to cooperate on matters of shared interest. The special relationship, however, bruised, bent but did not break. What the broader diplomatic response revealed was the uncomfortable reality that international intelligence relationships involve a degree of tolerance for activities that would be unconscionable in any other context. The countries whose passport systems had been abused were the same countries whose intelligence services maintained ongoing cooperation agreements with Israel on counterterrorism, on Iran-related intelligence, on a range of other matters that both parties considered valuable. The choice facing each of those governments was not simply about the Dubai operation in isolation. It was about what precedent their response would set, how firmly they were prepared to push back against an ally whose security relationship they valued, and what threshold they were willing to establish for the kinds of actions they would formally sanction through the diplomatic tools at their disposal. The expelled diplomat in each case was a statement. The maintained relationship in each case was the fuller answer to the question those governments were actually being asked. The debate over what happened in Room 230 has never been confined to the question of who did it. From the moment the investigation identified the operation as a state-sponsored killing and public attention settled on the broader implications, a second and more fundamental argument began running alongside the factual inquiry. That argument concerned whether what was done, the deliberate killing of a named individual by operatives of a foreign intelligence service, carried out in the territory of a third country, without any legal process, was justifiable. It is a question that produces genuinely irreconcilable answers depending on the framework the person answering it is using, and it has not been settled in the years since Dubai. The Israeli framework for targeted killing, as articulated by former officials and legal scholars who have examined it from the inside, rests on the doctrine of anticipatory self-defense. The claim that when a state faces a credible and ongoing threat from a specific individual or organization, and when the mechanisms of criminal law are genuinely unavailable because the individual operates in a jurisdiction that will not cooperate with extradition or prosecution, and when the threat is material rather than theoretical, the state has both the right and the obligation to remove that threat through whatever means are available. Al-Mabhouh, in this framework, was not merely a criminal suspect awaiting trial. He was an active combatant in an ongoing conflict who had killed Israeli citizens, had continued to arm an organization that was killing Israeli citizens, and who could not be reached through any other means. His elimination was, in this view, a defensive action rather than a prosecution. The counterargument, urged by international law scholars and human rights organizations who have examined Israeli targeted killing doctrine systematically across multiple cases, proceeds from a different starting point. International humanitarian law, the body of rules governing armed conflict, does allow for the killing of combatants in active hostilities. But Al-Mabhouh was not killed on a battlefield. He was killed in a hotel room in a neutral country, on the territory of a state that was not party to any conflict with Israel, under circumstances that were specifically designed to look like a medical event in order to prevent the kind of scrutiny that might produce accountability. The argument from armed conflict law, in this view, requires an honest accounting of where and under what circumstances a person is killed, and a hotel in Dubai does not meet any defensible definition of a battlefield. What happened in Room 230 was, in this analytical framework, an unlawful extrajudicial execution, regardless of the identity of the victim. Both of these positions have been argued at length in legal journals, in academic conferences, and in the proceedings of international bodies that have considered targeted killing as a policy generally. The fact that neither has definitively prevailed, that the debate remains active and unresolved, reflects a genuine tension at the heart of contemporary international law, which was built largely around state-to-state conflict and has struggled to adapt to a world in which non-state armed actors operate across multiple jurisdictions and conventional legal mechanisms are often unable to reach them. The people who argue for Israeli targeted killing doctrine are not arguing in bad faith. They are pointing to real gaps in the international legal framework that make it difficult to hold states to a standard of restraint whose alternative, doing nothing while the threat continues, carries its own severe costs. But the Dubai case introduced a specific element that even supporters of targeted killing doctrine found harder to defend without qualification. The use of allied nations' passports without those nations' knowledge or consent for an operation that exposed real civilians to serious harm. The British, Australian, Irish, French, and German citizens whose identities were lifted were not combatants in any conflict. They were ordinary people who woke up one February morning to find their names attached in international press coverage to an assassination in the Gulf. Several of them had difficulty with their own governments for a period as the investigations sorted out what had happened. One British citizen named in the initial reports described the experience of being contacted by journalists, by police investigators, and by neighbors who had seen his name in the news as profoundly disorienting, a violation of his ordinary life by an event he had played no part in and had not even been aware of until it was over. The question of accountability, what actually happened to anyone involved, is answered when answered honestly by an absence. No Israeli official was charged with any crime by any jurisdiction. No operative identified in the Dubai investigation was arrested. Interpol red notices attached to false names produced no arrests because the real individuals behind those names had never been identified in any publicly accessible document. The UAE issued arrest warrants. They remained unexecuted. Dahi Khalfan made additional public statements over the following years calling for international accountability, calling for specific named individuals to be prosecuted, calling for the extradition of Mossad operatives. None of it produced a result that the formal legal system could record as a conviction or a sentence. The operation had succeeded in its primary objective, and its perpetrators had never faced any judicial consequence for any aspect of what they had done. The Mossad director at the time, Meir Dagan, a figure whose career had made him one of the most influential intelligence chiefs in Israel's history, retired in 2011 as he had been scheduled to do, receiving the customary honors attendant on a successful tenure. His successor, Tamir Pardo, assumed the role without any public accounting being required of the institution for what the Dubai investigation had so thoroughly documented. The political directorate that had authorized the operation, Prime Minister Netanyahu's office, never addressed the matter publicly in terms more specific than the standard non-denial formula. The legal framework that had authorized the killing remained in place, unchanged and unchallenged in any form that binding law could enforce. One specific consequence that did produce measurable policy change was the passport security reform adopted in several countries, most significantly Britain and Australia, in the aftermath of the affair. Both countries introduced new protocols for the monitoring of dual nationals' passport data and new restrictions on the sharing of passport biometric information through channels that might be accessible to foreign intelligence services. The reforms were frankly described by officials as responses to what Dubai had revealed. The specific vulnerability exploited by the Dubai operation, even though those officials were careful not to name Israel in the context of those reforms in any official document. The practical effect was to close, at least partially, the specific door that had been walked through in the preparation of the 27 cover identities. Whether the door was actually closed or merely made harder to open has not been publicly verified. Within Hamas, Al-Mabhouh's death produced both grief and reorganization. He had been one of a relatively small number of people with the institutional knowledge, the relationship networks, and the operational experience to manage the arms procurement system at the scale and sophistication it had reached by 2010. Replacing that capacity took time. In the years following his death, investigations and reporting on Hamas's military supply chains suggested that the pipeline from Iran had been disrupted but not eliminated. Hamas continued to receive weapons, continued to develop its rocket capabilities, and eventually demonstrated during the 2014 and 2021 Gaza conflicts that its military capacity had grown substantially beyond what it had been at the time of Al-Mabhouh's death. Whether those capabilities would have grown faster with him alive, or whether his removal contributed meaningfully to setbacks in the arms procurement program, is genuinely unknowable. What can be said is that in the years after Dubai, the debate over the moral and legal character of what had been done there did not settle. New information periodically refreshed it. A book published in 2012 by journalists Ronan Bergman and others provided detailed accounts of the Israeli targeted killing program that, while heavily contested in some of its specific claims, significantly expanded the public record of how such operations were planned and authorized. Academic literature on targeted killing proliferated. The American drone program, which was ramping up through exactly this period, created parallel debates with precisely the same underlying tensions: anticipatory self-defense versus extrajudicial execution, lawful combatant versus unlawful killing, that allowed the Dubai arguments to be rehearsed and extended in a much larger context. The 27 names on the Interpol notices remain formally outstanding. No one has ever been brought to trial for the killing of Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh. Room 230 at the Al-Bustan Ratana Garhoud has been occupied by thousands of other guests since January 2010. None of them aware of its specific history unless they happen to know the story and happen to check the hotel's location against the address they were given at reception. There is a question that sits beneath all the others when you examine the Dubai operation with the full benefit of time and retrospect. Did it work? Not in the immediate and operational sense. A man was killed, an objective was achieved, the team exited successfully. In those terms, the operation was what it was designed to be. But intelligence operations are assessed not only by whether they achieve their immediate objective but by whether the costs they incurred were proportional to the results they produced, whether the lasting consequences matched the expectations of those who authorized them, and whether the world that followed the operation was meaningfully different from the world that would have followed a decision not to act. The arms pipeline that Al-Mabhouh maintained did not die with him. No single person, however operationally central, is the unique carrier of the institutional knowledge and relationships that constitute a functioning intelligence network. The Quds Force officers he had worked with in Tehran remained in their positions. The Syrian intermediaries who had facilitated aspects of the procurement chain continued to operate. Hamas's military wing, though it mourned Al-Mabhouh as a significant and personally irreplaceable figure, had organizational continuity that absorbed the loss. Rocket production in Gaza continued. Weapon imports continued through whatever supply routes remained usable. The relationship between Iran and Hamas, which Al-Mabhouh had helped build and sustain, was not disrupted by his death in any measurable long-term way. The rockets that fell on Israeli cities during the major Gaza conflicts of 2012, 2014, and 2021 were fired by an organization whose military capacity had grown substantially since January 2010. The pipeline was disrupted, not severed. This is not an unusual outcome for targeted killing operations. The academic literature on the effectiveness of leadership decapitation as a counterterrorism strategy is mixed, and the rigorous studies that have attempted to measure whether killing senior operatives actually reduces an organization's capacity or merely redistributes it tend to produce conclusions that are more cautious than the confident assertions made by governments that employ the strategy. Organizations adapt. Successors emerge. Institutional knowledge, while not perfectly transferable, is more resilient than any individual. Al-Mabhouh's death required Hamas to find new people for aspects of the work he had been doing, and that transition carried costs in time and efficiency. But the transition did occur. What the Dubai operation produced most durably was not a change in Hamas's military capacity, which continued to grow, but a profound change in how professional intelligence operations are conducted in a world saturated with camera systems. The operation has been studied in security and intelligence academic programs around the world as a case study in surveillance exposure, analyzed specifically for the degree to which the team's physical movements were captured and subsequently reconstructed in public detail. The lesson that analysts and trainers drew from it was stark. No amount of cover identity sophistication protects an operation once every step of its execution has been recorded in high resolution by systems operating continuously and archiving everything. Dubai was, in this reading, a turning point in the arms race between covert operational capability and the ubiquitous surveillance that modern urban environments impose. Subsequent Mossad operations that became public, or were publicly attributed to Israel, showed evidence of absorbing those lessons. The assassination of Iranian nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in November 2020, carried out on a road in Iran using a remote-controlled gun system, reflected a philosophy of minimizing human presence at the kill site, eliminating the footprint problem that Dubai had made so visible. The operation reportedly involved a weapon operated remotely through satellite, a solution that, whatever its moral dimensions, was specifically designed to avoid the kind of physical trail that had exposed 27 operatives in Dubai. The adaptation was real and observable. For the people whose names had been used, the 12 Britons, the 6 Australians, the 4 Irish, and the others, the lasting consequence was primarily the experience of a single extraordinary disruption to their ordinary lives, followed by a return to ordinariness that the world's attention had departed from within weeks. Several gave interviews in the period immediately after their names became public. Most described the same combination of bewilderment and violation, the specific unease of knowing that someone had taken your name and your biographical facts and used them for something you played no part in and never consented to. None of them faced criminal consequences. None of them were harmed physically. Their ordinary lives continued, though perhaps with a somewhat heightened awareness that the documents establishing their identities in the world were less secure than they had assumed. For Dubai, the investigation and its results produced something approaching reputational enhancement within the intelligence community. The thoroughness of what Dahi Khalfan's team assembled, the completeness of the reconstruction, the speed of the identification process, the willingness to present the evidence publicly despite the political sensitivities involved, demonstrated that the UAE was a more capable investigative state than some had assumed. The performance raised Dubai's profile as a surveillance state of genuine capability, which had its own deterrent implications for anyone who subsequently considered using the city as an operational ground, assuming that the cameras were either sparse or poorly managed. They were neither. The question of whether Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh deserved what happened to him is one that different people answer in radically different ways, and those answers track predictably along the lines of existing political sympathies. For Israelis who lost family members to Hamas violence, and for the Israeli security establishment that tracked Al-Mabhouh through 2 decades of armed activity that cost Israeli lives, the answer is nearly always the same. He was a combatant, a killer, a man who organized the deaths of soldiers and civilians and who spent his career making it easier for more Israeli deaths to occur. The families of Ilan Sadan and Avi Sportas spent years seeking acknowledgement of what had happened to their sons, and Al-Mabhouh's name appeared in every one of those acknowledgements in the same connection. His death is not something they mourned. For Palestinians and for those who frame the conflict through the lens of resistance to military occupation, Al-Mabhouh was something entirely different. A military commander who built the material capacity of an armed resistance movement in defense of a population under blockade, who spent his life and ultimately gave his life in service of a cause that, whatever the methods employed, responded to real and documented injustice. Hamas declared him a martyr in the formal Islamic sense of the term, a fighter killed in defense of his people, and that designation carries both religious and political weight within the community that maintains it. Streets were named for him in Gaza. He was given the public honors of someone whose organization considered him a hero. The distance between those two frameworks is not one that any investigation, however thorough, can close. The cameras of Dubai recorded everything they could see. They recorded movements and meetings and the opening of a hotel room door and the departure of a team of professionals who had done what they came to do. What they could not record, what no camera in any city could ever record, was the 60 years of history and violence and grief and political failure and human cost that had produced the conditions in which a man like Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh was possible, in which a decision to kill him could be authorized with the assurance of legal coverage and strategic justification, in which 27 trained people could be deployed across an international city to end one life and then scatter across the world before anyone noticed. All of that is what lies on either side of the door to room 230, and all of it predates the cameras that captured it, and all of it will continue long after the footage has been archived and re-archived and eventually superseded by newer records of newer events in a conflict that has not ended and that the death of Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh did not bring one measurable step closer to ending. The operation was surgically precise and forensically imperfect and strategically ambiguous and morally contested and diplomatically damaging to the country that conducted it, and it was, by any honest accounting, absolutely typical of the modern targeted killing era in every one of those respects simultaneously. That is what remains of Dubai, January 19, 2010. A hotel room, a trail of footage, a set of names that pointed nowhere useful, and a question about what we permit states to do in our name that we have been arguing about for decades and will be arguing about for decades to come, because the question is genuinely hard, and the hardness of it does not diminish with repetition.